The cell membrane is said to be semi-permeable. This means that some things are able to freely and easily cross the cell membrane, while some other things have difficulties. So the cell membrane can let some things in, whilst other things it might refuse unless they have a particular different method to getting across the cell membrane. So the first type of material, or first type of molecule that we're going to look at are hydrophobic small molecules. So if we have some molecules that are hydrophobic, so water hating, and small, these molecules find it quite easy to pass straight through the cell membrane. So we're talking about things like oxygen and CO2. What they're able to do is they're able to move straight through the phospholipid bilayer and out the other side. So they can enter and exit the cell straight through the cell membrane, straight through the phospholipid bilayer quite easily, because they are small, so they're able to fit, and they're also hydrophobic, which means they are happy to move through that hydrophobic environment that is the tails, facing inwards in the phospholipid bilayer. Now, if we have larger molecules, especially if these are hydrophilic, so water-loving, these are going to find it quite difficult to make their way across the cell membrane because of their size. They're going to find it too hard to make their way through the phospholipids. And if they're hydrophilic, so water-loving, they're also not going to want to enter that hydrophobic environment, the tails. So one such molecule is glucose. And if we have a glucose molecule here, like so, let's say this is glucose. The way in which glucose is going to pass through the membrane is through something called a carrier protein. And these carrier proteins can kind of open and shut at either end. So say we're looking at the outside of the cell where the glucose is at the moment. Glucose is going to move into a carrier protein and then into a specific kind of section that it might have nestled into the protein. So what can happen is glucose can move down into this carrier protein. The protein will be open at the outside end and shut at the inside end. It will then swap this over, so it will shut. This is kind of the second step here. So it will shut behind the glucose and open at the other end, allowing the glucose entry into the cell, like so. Another type of molecule which needs to try and make its way across the cell membrane are, once again, small molecules. But if we have small molecules that are hydrophilic, even though they are small enough to technically pass through the cell membrane, through the phospholipid bilayer, due to the fact that they're hydrophilic, so water-loving, they can't enter that hydrophobic, water-hating environment of the tails. So what they're going to need is they're going to need a channel protein or a transport protein. So we have here a channel or transport protein. So those terms are kind of interchangeable. So what will happen here is these small hydrophilic molecules can make their way through the center of a protein, which is going to have a hydrophilic environment, meaning that they don't need to try and make their way through the hydrophobic tails, and they're able to pass from outside to inside of the cell or vice versa. The last type of molecule we're going to look at are ions. Now, ions are charged, which makes it impossible for them, or at least extremely hard for them, to make their way straight through the phospholipid bilayer because of their charge. So if we're talking about something like sodium ions, Na+, Na+, these are going to have a torrid time trying to get through the phospholipid bilayer. The charge won't allow them. So once again, what they're going to need is a channel type protein, and then these ions can make their way through the center of the protein. They're not having to push their way through the phospholipid bilayer and can make their way into or out of the cell. Now, the only other thing to mention is some of these processes happen passively. So passive means no energy. So for example, things like the oxygen and carbon dioxide moving through the phospholipid bilayer don't require energy. Some channel proteins won't require energy for things to pass through. Or we can have processes which are active, which equals energy being needed. So things like the carrier protein here might require it. Things like ions often need to be pumped or moved across with energy against the direction that they naturally want to move. So there's a few different ways, a few of the main ways that different molecules cross the membrane, whether innate of a protein or not. And some of these processes are passive, which require no energy, while some of these processes are active, which do require energy.